Alright, so in this video we are going to implement being able to leave a game and rejoin a game, and also be able to abandon a game and have that game be destroyed and set in the database that has been destroyed when everybody in that particular game leaves. So what we need to do in our region server project is we need an object that represents a player in a game that can leave or abandon. And that object is going to be tracked by our running game, so that if the add player method is invoked at any point, which happens when we add the player to the game, which happens when we log in to the game server, if that player had already been added to the game, then we just reattach this particular player context game to that object, or we create a new one of these objects, or we initialize it to create something like the avatar actor that's going to be used by the game simulation to replicate that player's state to everybody else. So yay for naming things. We need so let's see here. Let's think. So I paused the video for a moment and kind of diagrammed out how all of these objects kind of work together. So at the top here, we have a player connection, player context. And these are blue because they're things that can be created and destroyed even during a game that's running. A player can disconnect or abandon or whatever. But the player context is what he's going to do is he's going to talk to the running game, and the running game is going to, and all these guys in orange and in red there represent objects that are going to be around for the entirety of the game. So these are things that are going to stick around. So we'll have the player context talking to the running game, hey, I just joined, go ahead and add me to the game. The running game is going to communicate with the game loop. The game loop is going to control the actors, the AI, and logic. And one of the actors that the game loop is going to control, or at least communicate state updates to, is the player's avatar actor. So there'll be actors in this game engine, but they, and one of those actors, they represent both visible and non-visible things. So actors can be purely logic, or they can be actual physical items that need to be positioned, and we need to replicate that data to everybody and saying what position is that object in, what state is that object in. And so we're going to use a avatar actor, which will be a special type of actor that represents a player that's currently in the game. And the player avatar actor will both communicate to and be communicated by this object, this player in game. And then the player in game, when he receives state updates from the game engine, will communicate all the way back to the player connection. However, the player context will also communicate directly with the player in game in telling it what to do, move, activate this ability or whatever, so that he can then relay that information to the player avatar actor. And then that will cause that actor to move, and that'll update whatever game logic happens when you move to a particular thing. Probably we're going to be implementing some pathfinding here for this game. So anyway, that's a basic diagram of how these things will work together. So far we have the player connection, we have the player context, and we have the concept of the running game. Don't yet have a game loop or any actor logic, nor do we have player in game. I think we're going to implement player in game first before we implement anything else, because that's like I said earlier, that's the object that we're going to be using to know if a player has joined or abandoned or left or whatever. So I'll just move this off the side here. And so when we add a player, we have to instantiate one of those players in games. Now for synchronization, I know earlier I said that we were going to hijack, or I was thinking about hijacking the game engine loop itself for synchronization. And I'm thinking about that, and that might not be a terrible idea to still do that, but that will, of course, require that we rewrite these methods just a little bit to hook into the game engine synchronization when we need to. Basically, the game engine is going to be running at X, it's going to run through its game loop X amount of times per second, and we'll have a mechanism to queue an action to be invoked on one of those ticks. And the reason for that is that when a player joins, we need to do things like add new listeners to the game state and create a new avatar actor and all of that stuff. And having that synchronized on the game loop will make synchronization trivial because it's all synchronized on that one loop. So anyway, so adding a player, we can go ahead and delete that. I will write another to-do in here though, saying sync with game loop. I don't think we're going to run into any synchronization issues at the present moment with this. We might, but maybe not. But we definitely would if we never added any synchronization logic here into this particular add player method. But, alright, so we need a concept of a player in a game. And let's think here. I'm just going to go ahead and call it player in game, and I'll add it to the base namespace. I might move this class. I will be creating another namespace for all game engine, game loop related classes. But for this, we'll just do player in game. And now player in game is like you saw in the diagram. He's going to have a reference, or he's going to know if the player is connected. So he'll have a reference to the game info system. And, whoops, I deleted the code that created the game info system. I'm going to go ahead and add that back in. So the player in game does have a reference to the game info system. He'll also have a reference to the player's avatar. And he'll also have methods on him for indicating whether or not the player is currently connected. So I think a good way to do that, so you can, again, player in game is the glue between a player connection and a player avatar. So we'll have a game info, a reference to a game info system to represent the connection. See, this is an interesting thing here. Should I use a game info system reference to indicate a reference to the connection, or should I just use a straight up context, player game context? The question comes down to whether or not I need to access the game info system repeatedly. And actually, I would have to in a couple scenarios, like updating when a player leaves or player joins or anything like that, as well as game state. I'll just leave it like that. And then I will call this player connection. I don't know if that's a good name. And we'll have a get and we'll have a private set. And then I'll have a public boolean is connected, which will simply be a getter that'll say player connection does not equal null. And he's also going to have a public bool has abandoned. Get private set to know if that player has totally abandoned that game or not. So yeah, so we'll need a couple methods for setting the player connection. So we'll do connect player. Well, see, connect player, what kind of logic do we need here? I think I'm going to leave this class relatively dumb for now. So connect player is just going to, or player connected. Whoops, I need a void. Player connected game info system connection, and we'll say player connection equals connection, and then we'll have a public void player disconnected game info system, or just that, and we'll set player connection to null. I'll take out, actually I don't like the names of these methods. No, I think I do, because this is just responding to the events from the game info system. Again, the player in game is going to be dumb for right now. It's just a glue to the player avatar, which will have a constructor, and I'll leave it pretty much empty, but to do pass in player avatar object or actor object. So then we'll also have a public void player abandoned. As abandoned equals false. So you notice that I'm really just creating this class. It has really two interesting properties on it that are set, and they're both set by these methods, as opposed to giving these properties setters. I think I like the naming, though, of that a little bit more. But anyway, so for a running game, we're going to need a dictionary from the player ID to the player in game. So I'll have a public or a private read-only dictionary of int and player in game, and we'll call this players. And then we'll go ahead and instantiate that. Here's the first thing. Dictionary of int player in game. And what we want to do in this constructor here, so we already have game parameters which contains name, ID, teams, and heroes. I think what I'm going to do here is basically I'm going to go ahead and preemptively fill our entire dictionary. So I'm actually going to move this instantiation down here. And then I'm simply going to say for each var player in parameters dot player details. And then I'm going to say players dot add player dot ID, comma, new player in game. And we're not going to pass anything into that for now. So now the running game has a object for every single player that should be in a game, or in this particular game. So now what I can do is jump down into add player, and we're going to do a couple of things. So the first thing we're going to do is say var player equals players at context user details ID, and then we're going to say player dot player connected on player, or whoops, on system. And then we're going to want to relay all the information about the existing players to that system. So I want to say for each var player or other player in players.values, and we want to send that information to the system. So I'm going to say system.proxy.addPlayer, and it wants a game player details, which is that game player details, which is the information about like what points a player has and all that stuff. And in addition to that, I also want to indicate when the player connects that the player is connected to everyone. So for other players, the system proxy game player details will do new game player details, passing in our information. So ID is other player dot, of course we don't have that value. We don't have the name, the team, or the hero information. Let's see. I think what I'm going to do here is player in game is going to have a game player details object on it cached. So let's go ahead and jump back into player in game. And I'm going to do a public game player details with just a straight up getter, just a straight up getter, and we'll have a game player details parameter in the constructor, and I'll just go ahead and initialize our property to that parameter. And then when player connected, we're going to do details has or is connected as false by default, even though that'll be the default of a Boolean anyway. And then when player connected, we'll do details is connected as true. When player disconnected, we'll do details is connected as false. And when player abandoned, we'll do details is connected equals false, and details has abandoned is true, which means we can, this was already incorrect, I'm setting has abandoned to false, which means we can just remove the has abandoned property entirely. And with that, so now this is enough information to keep track of whether or not a player is connected. We can kind of cache the game player details so we don't have to create it all the time. But now, going back into the running game, we do need to come up here and change the instantiation of player in game. So I'm going to say player in game equals new game player details, and I'm going to pass in those details. So I'm going to do ID is player.id, name is player.name, hero is player.hero, team is player.team, and has abandoned is false, and is connected is false, which are Boolean defaults, but whatever. So now that we have that information, we can now come to when we add a player, we can go ahead and inform that player of all the other players that are supposed to be in this current game simply by doing system proxy add player other player dot details. And that makes that super easy. So in addition to that, we also have to inform the other players that this player has connected again. So to do that, let's come back up here, and I'm going to create a private read-only iGameInfo client. I'm going to call this proxy. And then I'm going to set it. I'm going to set it proxy equals broadcast proxy iGameInfo client dot create. We have to pass in a server context and an enumerable of transport. So we have to make sure that we get a game server context, which we already have a reference to anyway. So create with the server context. For the transports, we want to, whenever we invoke a method on this proxy, we want it to broadcast to all of the currently connected players. So what that's going to be basically is players dot where t goes into t value is connected dot select t goes into t value player connection dot context dot transport. So with this code, every time we invoke a method on this proxy, it's going to check for all the players that are currently connected, and then it's going to broadcast that event to each one of their individual transports. So again, we can invoke a method on this proxy, and it'll broadcast everybody who's currently connected, which is what we want. So with that, we can come down here to add player, and after we tell the player who just connected about all the other players, well, actually, before we invoke player connected, I'm going to do proxy add player player dot details, and that'll inform everybody that this guy. Well, now I have an issue here. Actually, no, I don't. See, the issue I was thinking is when we invoke player.player connected, that's going to set his is connected as true, which will result in the proxy invoking methods on this proxy being broadcasted back to that player. But if we don't invoke the player connected, then when we do proxy.addPlayer, the player.details will have is connected set to false. However, I don't think that's going to be a problem. And the reason is this will allow, this is a really cheap way to go ahead and tell the player about the details of his connection, how many points he has and what his stats are and all that fun stuff, because he already knows his ID. So on the client side, what we can do is say if the add player method was invoked and it's the same ID as the user that we logged in with, then this is us, and we can set our information appropriately. If it's not the same ID as what we logged in as, then that means it's another player. Anyways, let's go ahead and test this. I'm going to hit F6. I already have everything running. I'll jump over to Log Fusion and make sure that this gets restarted. Let's wait for a moment for it to restart. Yep, it's restarted. Now let's come back to Unity. I'm going to go ahead and hit Control-B to open up a different connection here. So we can log in as two individual people, join a lobby, and start a game. And we'll hit play, then in the meantime we'll come over here and we'll hit play, and then we'll wait for the database connection to spool up eventually. Log in as admin there, log in as Nelson over here, create a lobby as admin. I'll join admin 1's lobby, and let's set some information. He's going to be that, and he's going to be that. And then we'll go ahead and hit start, and there was a fatal error. And the fatal error was a dependency resolution exception. Exception was thrown by invoking our game entity service. Value cannot be null. Exception was thrown by invoking constructor game entity service game server context, game parameters, on type, running game, value cannot be null. Okay, well, that didn't work. Let's jump up here. Let's see what would be null. Oh, what would be null would be the fact that I created that proxy before I instantiated the players. And remember that this code is deferred. So what that means is, even though I'm passing in a link query here, it's not going to get evaluated until it's asked for. And so that's why I can put in this where and select, and those wheres and selects will be reevaluated every time that it's invoked. So let's go ahead and hit start. Hit start. Come back here, hit Control B. I need to come up with a better testing solution for this, because having to hit Control B for multiple players at once is really, really, really annoying. Anyway, go ahead and do that. Do that. The master server should already be spooled up, and it is. Login as admin, login as Nelson. Nelson's going to create a lobby. And it looks like we have an issue where our start and destroy methods... Our start method just doesn't do anything, and our destroy method throws that error. Actually, the start method is not doing anything. So that's weird that the start method and destroy methods are appearing there even though they shouldn't. But we'll figure that out in a moment here. Let's go ahead and set some parameters. Set tank, then Alethian, set damage, and human. Then I'll come over here and hit start. And we started the game. Okay, so what we got was a disconnect by server logic. Object reference not set to an instance of an object. Context type player is not valid. Context type player is not valid. Well, that's a silly error. It seems to be happening on a Photon socket server peer base. No, on BuzzMMO server MMO peer base. So MMO peer base is throwing an exception. And it's throwing an exception right here because client context is null when we invoked create context. So let's jump into our peer on our region server and see what's going on here. So for some reason our context is the type equals player, but we're okay, so somehow player in game is null. So that's interesting. Let's go ahead and look at the database and see what happened there. So in our game entities, oh come on, open the table. In our game entities, we have something that was created today, and that is ID 9. And then in user and games, we have a game ID of 9 and a game ID of 9 with player ID 2 and a player ID of 1. But for some reason, that player ID... Let's go ahead and add some logic here, or some logging here. It would be nice to, of course, have some debugging support, but whatever. So log info, we're simply going to say player with token is connecting to game ID. So let's make sure has abandoned is false on both of them, and the game ID is 9. Okay. So somehow a token isn't being sent. And I want to find out which one of the players the token is not being sent on. And I have a feeling it has something to do with the difference between a player who began the game himself and a player who was just part of the game. So my theory is that the token is either going to be null or malformed on the player that did not start the game. So let's create a lobby here. Let's join that lobby and let's hit start. Okay, so now we should have some more debugging information. And we have player with token. So the token is being sent properly. And I'm looking at the database right now, and OKTY, and JZU. both tokens are invalid, or are valid. So it looks like our get player in game is somehow returning null. So let's see here. Oh, wow, I'm an idiot. So the problem here is that we're doing users and games, and we're saying first or default on the game server ID is us, and the game ID is us. Well, it doesn't say anything about the individual player of who connected. So in our database query, we'll also have to put in and t.token is token. We are still going to check to see if the token does not equal token down here as well. And I'm gonna put some logging in here actually. So I'm gonna say log warn player with token for game ID not found. And then if the token is similar but is in different casing, we'll do log warn player with token for game ID as an invalid token. All right, so let's go ahead and hit F6. This will cause both servers to restart in this case. So let's come back here and hit Control B. And in theory, everything should work now. I hope. So we'll hit play. And we're going to have to wait for the database to spool up, of course, as always. Admin, blah, blah, blah. Start as tank and human. And then I'm going to do support and Alethian. And then we'll just hit start. And check that out. So we got us twice. And then Nelson. Well, we did get that information. So that's cool. But we got us twice, which was unfortunate. So let's figure out why we got us twice in that. So if we come back into running game, why would that happen? So do proxy, add player, details. Oh. So we're looping through all the players, but again, we're not checking A to see if those players are connected, which would throw an exception, by the way, which I'm surprised didn't. Probably because of the there's probably a race condition, because we don't have any synchronization. And we also didn't check to see if the other player was us. So I'm going to say, if not, other player dot is connected, or other player equals us, then continue. And so this way, we will only be informed of other players that aren't us. We've already been informed of us because of this code up here. And there we go. So that should work. So now the server is keeping track of all the players that have connected, and the client is keeping track, or knows about all the other players that should be in the game, at least their metadata, as far as the information that they chose when they joined the game. So now I want to implement the ability to leave a game. So leaving a game, what I'm going to do is I'm going to implement something on the client side. So we have our UI, our game UI, and it has this button down here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this button and I'm going to change it to leave game. We'll create another button for abandoning game later, and in the future we'll have something like an escape menu where you hit escape and you get a main menu. But for now we'll just leave this button down here because we're not too interested in anything else. And so now what we need to do is we do need to figure out how to hook up this leave game UI element to our game system. So on a game server, we get a game info. And when game info is created, that means we have successfully connected to the game server. It also means that we've loaded the scenes, because we load our level name first, our level first, then we connect. So the scene's already connected, the game UI already exists. So we need a way for us to create an event handler. Why did my text go away? There you are. We need a way to hook up a an object in our UI that's responsible for doing things. So let's think about how we would do that. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an object or class. Let's see, how do we want to break it up into multiple classes or not? Let's just do user interface, just a generic user interface class, and it will be a mono behavior. And it's going to have a public void set game context. Actually, I have a better idea. In my infrastructure, I'm going to create a new interface. Yeah. Create a new interface called I receive game context. And it's going to have a void receive context, which will receive game context. Well, no. I want to make this, I don't want to generalize this just yet. I want to make this specific to the game server. So I'll do I receive game server. I'll have void receive game server. Then in our user interface, which is just generically named right now, we'll rename it. We'll probably break it out into other things later, but he's going to implement I receive game server, and I'll have a receive game server, and he's simply going to say underscore game server equals server. And then he's going to have a public void leave game method, which will be invoked by the UI, which is going to do game server dot. So we need to reference to. What happens if we invoke destroy? Again, we do a transport disconnect. We need a reference to the game context. So I'm going to go ahead and take this private field and encapsulate it. Then I'm going to do game server dot context dot connect to master server. So invoke the leave game method on the user interface. We will just connect straight to the master server. Now, for the I receive game server, what I'm going to do is what this is going to be for. Is this going to be for game objects that exist in the scene before we start a game? Then when the game starts, when the game server is connected, then he's going to query the scene for every single mono behavior that implements this interface and set it on it. So on the game server itself, after we do the on success, before we send the init context, I'm going to say for each var game server receiver in game object dot find object of type, or find objects of type I receive game server. And what are you yelling at me? Oh. When we do an interface, we have to pass in a type of this. And then we'll say game server receiver dot, or we'll have to cast it because this is not casted. Game server receiver dot receive game server this. All right. There we go. So now I should be able to jump in here and the leave game button should work. Well, actually, no, it's not going to because I didn't put the... It's like, what was that error? Seems missing a camera. Oh, never mind, don't care. I need to add the game server user interface component. I'm going to add that just to the canvas here directly. Actually, no, I'm not. I'm going to create a new empty game object. User interface, and then I'm going to add that. And then I'm going to go into the button, and I'm going to add a on-click handler to user interface, and it's going to be user interface dot leave game. So now we can jump back into our scenes loader. I can hit run, log in here, hit start, join a game. Type has to be derived. Oh, really? You're not going to let me do that? Huh. I've been able to use get components in children before with an interface, but unfortunately it doesn't seem like I can do that on the entire scene. Which is unfortunate, which means I receive game server is now going to be a mono behavior. So I'm going to come up over here, I'm going to basically rename it to receive game server. I'm going to change it to a public class, and it's going to inherit from mono behavior, and it's going to have a public abstract receive game server. And of course we have to make this an abstract class. And what am I missing? Public abstract receive game server. I can't have it be the same name as the type, so I need to set game server. What are you complaining about? Oh wow, I'm an idiot. I'm an idiot, sorry. I derped out and realized that I have to give it a return type, because this is C# and this is not JavaScript. Okay, so now I'm going to come back to user interface. I'm going to change this to receive game server. Actually, no, we can't get away with that. And then I'm going to change this to that, and then it's going to be a public override void set game server. And obviously, you can't do that. Okay, so now I can come back into the game server, and I'm just going to do the generic. I can now do the generic form of the find objects of type. And then I can simply say set game server this. All right, now everyone should be happy. Jumping back into Unity, let's hit play. Log as admin, create, start. And now if we hit leave game, we jump back here. Now we don't automatically relog in. That's going to be something that we're going to also have to handle, but we'll do that separately. Probably by regenerating a token or something like that. But yeah, so the last thing I want to do here is I want to come over here to running game. So when a player disconnects, we want to set their is connected to false, obviously. So what I'm going to do here is right before this, I'm going to say context disconnected plus equals player disconnected, and we'll say create method player disconnected player, and then over here what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, or I'm going to call this context. I'm going to say var player equals players at context, or context dot user details ID. We'll put in a to do sync with game loop. And then I'm going to set player, I'm going to say player dot player disconnected, and then I'm going to say proxy dot update player details, or player dot details. Then we'll hit this, or F6 rather, to do a rebuild. And so now we should be informed when a player disconnects and when a player reconnects. So now I can jump back into Unity. We'll go ahead and hit Control B. And we'll hit play. Come over here, hit play. Log in as admin, log in as Nelson. Create a game. I'm just going to do none and none, I don't really care. Start the game. And we get game player 1 admin, none connected active, blah, blah, blah. And now if I leave the game as Nelson, we get game player 2 Nelson, none, none, not connected active. So we were indeed informed that the player has indeed disconnected from the game. And so we could also, yeah, so anyway. So that's the connection and disconnection code and all that fun stuff. And now we have the player and game class, which will be, again, responsible for the glue between the connected player as well as the player avatar. And with that, we'll see you guys in the next video.